Welcome everybody to lecture 3 of our course in behavioral economics. The first two lectures were rather heavy and solid and full of fundamental concepts that you would need to know if you want to pursue anything in behavioral economics. So I really suggest that you go back and read the required readings for those lectures and really get a solid grip on this. Now we're moving into biases and how biases affect our decision making. So the next lecture, this third lecture, is on biases, and it's a bit lighter on the concepts, but as very important as part of our process of unfreezing the decision making process in our mind, change it, and then freeze it back into a better state. So this is the process that we follow throughout the course. So let's get started. And the first bias we're talking about is overconfidence. Now, we have to clarify the concept of bias, and we'll do this over the course of the lecture. But bias is an overuse of a mental shortcut. So we come up with mental shortcuts to make our life easier, to make our decision process easier. But an overuse of a certain mental shortcut without checking it and thinking about it every once in a while, it becomes a bias. So we are biased without thinking too much about why are we biased. Okay, so one of the most important biases is overconfidence. And overconfidence is being tagged as the mother of all biases because a lot of things start from this bias, overconfidence bias. And some of them in the research in psychology of judgment, this is one of the most robust finding and is blamed for pretty much everything that wars, stock market bubbles, lawsuits, and entrepreneurial bankruptcy. All right, so one of the most important bias, as we said, because it starts and kind of gives birth to other biases in this course that we're going to talk. So overconfidence is studied in three ways. They're over precision, then the tendency that we are too sure that our judgment and decision are accurate, overestimation, we think we're better, smarter, faster, more capable, more attractive, more popular, and so on, than we actually are. This is you probably heard that if you ask any driver if he or she is above average, they will say yes, so which is kind of impossible. And this is the planning fallacy comes from when we think we need to accomplish something in a limited time and we think we have a lot of time to do it, and we're always pushing it towards a deadline and so on. And over placement, we're thinking that we're placing higher in a certain dimension, especially in competitive context. So these are the three ways that overconfidence starts to be studied: over precision, overestimation, and over placement. You don't really hear about these three separately, but you would know that they're coming from the same family. All right. Now, the easiest way that I know to study overconfidence is through examples. So the one that I studied when I took the same class with Professor Richard Thaler back in 2007, it was to study this book. The book is called Into Thin Air by John Krakauer, and it's been made into a movie with the same name. I believe the movie is called Death on Everest, right? And it's about an expedition on Everest in 1996 that went terribly wrong, and not because of natural causes like avalanches or things like that, but rather by human decision making. So if you haven't read the book or if you haven't seen the movie, I suggest you read it even after this lecture, because it's very important and it really exemplifies a lot of how we make decisions at the sea level, at the normal circumstances, and in situations where the emotions run high and we don't have enough mental capacity to make proper decisions. So this is the most important piece, where we're going from a confidence level at a C level, where we think we agree with the logical arguments, but in certain situations where emotions run high, we tend to forget the logical arguments and let emotions make decisions. And this the system 1, system 2 connection that we're going to see frequently when we make decisions. But the movie and the book exemplifies it pretty nicely. So I really suggest that you look at it. We'll talk about this movie and the book in the few slides in this lecture, and you'll see what it's about. Okay, so that on Everest starts with people trying to get on the Everest summit, to summit the Everest, and the question, the question is why. There's no doesn't make any sense. There's a lot of cost, a lot of effort, there's a lot of to summit the Everest, so there's no logical explanation that you can come up with that would make sense. So this is the first piece. We don't necessarily do things that make sense to us or to everybody else. So from the economic point of view, going out to the top of the mountain doesn't make any sense. Second, is becoming very overcrowded. It's becoming a business, it's becoming a very commercial, and you saw in the past events in 2019, almost the same thing happened. It's very similar, and if you see pictures, you see that it's becoming really a joke and very commercial. But anyway, so people go to base camp to acclimatize, and then from there they move gradually to camp 1, camp 2, camp 3, camp 4, and from camp 4 they try to make a run to the summit and come back, right? So this is, and now as you go up to these camps, what happens to the oxygen level? It goes drastically down, and from the base camp to camp 4, your oxygen level goes super low, and what it does from our point of view, it limits your capacity of making decision, period. It limits your capacity to really do anything but stay alive. So all the system 1 and system 2 are all stripped out by any kind of capabilities. All what's left of them is the mere capacity of survival. Okay, so in the book, before I go further to this slide, in the book there are 2 teams of climbers, one led by Rob Hall and one led by Scott Fisher. Both have businesses that are, their business model is to take people up to the summit and bring them back. The cost of such expedition are, very, very, very high, about $70,000 per participant, plus months of training and everything. Okay, that's great. Now, this is the number of summits starting from 1953, when Sir Edmund Hillary climbed the Mountain Everest for the first time, and going through decades up to 1996, when this event happens. And one thing you have to notice is that we have a lot of the summits, a lot of people getting to the summit in the 90s, right? So in the 90s, not as many in the 80s. As you can see, as you know, climbing a mountain is very weather dependent. If the weather lets you, you can go. If the weather doesn't let you, you cannot go. So in the 80s, not that many people were able to climb because the weather wasn't cooperating. In the 90s was a different story. The weather was good, and they only have a couple of weeks to ascend to the summit, and because the weather changes so fast. There's another issue we need to discuss in this situation, is that the Nepal government only issues certain amount of licenses or permits for people to go up to the mountain, and I believe this year is about 300 licenses. So there's a competition. Obviously, there's a lot of constraints: competition, time constraint, money constraint, and effort constraint. All right. So what we see here is that In the 80s, the weather wasn't that great. In the 90s, it was good. And similarly, in the same graph, we have the number of deaths, right? As you can see, the number of deaths in the 90s was, how do I say, maybe it was normal, in the normal range. In the 80s was a little bit higher compared to if you look at the number of summits. So in the 90s, things were looking better, except this big line in 1996 that we're talking about now. Okay, this is just a picture how things look like there, and it, again, for some of us, the question is, why would you do that? Doesn't make sense. Okay, so we'll talk about three biases. We call them cognitive biases in this particular case. One is overconfidence, second one is sunk cost effect, and recency effect. We'll talk about every one at a time. Overconfidence. Now, let me read this first. This is a quote from Scott Fisher, one of the other guides, head guides. And he says, we've got the big E completely figured out. We've got it totally wired. These days, I'm telling you, we built a yellow brick road to the summit. Yellow brick road is a reference to the Wizard of Oz, where Dorothy and the crew was traveling on a very specific, clear, yellow brick road, like a highway, if you will. So let's talk about overconfidence. Scott Fisher is the leader of the expedition. He's the leader that you depend, if you want to go with him, to keep you alive, getting you up to the summit and back down safely, right? So you do want your leader to be confident, to sound confident, right? That's what you're looking for. You expect that from a leader. I don't think it's going to look good on Scott Fisher if he said, I don't know, some of you might survive, some of you will not. I have no idea what to tell you because, it's a very dangerous expedition. So you want the leader to sound confident. The question is, to which degree, right? We want confident people, but not overconfident people. And we don't know exactly where that line is. And that line, it's usually filled in later after the outcome was out, right? So if everything was fine and they got up and come back alive, all of them, they would say, well, there was a confident leader. But if things go wrong, then we can say, well, after the fact, we're going to say, well, he was a bit overconfident. So the line is very blurry, and it takes a little bit of range. You don't know exactly where to place it, the line between overconfidence and confidence. Okay, so we decided we like confident leaders, and we don't know where they are overconfident. Rob Hall on the other team was also sending the same message. It worked 39 times so far, pal. A few of the blokes who summited with me were nearly as pathetic as you. He's referring at 39 people that he took up to the summit in the 90s. In the 90s, this is in the 90s. So he took 39 people. So obviously you expect that the 40th and the 41st person will have the same fate, which is, go up to the summit properly and come back alive. Okay, so he's trying to establish a pattern that it worked 39 times, and we expect that this to work in the future, right? Which by itself is a fallacy, right? These events are rather independent because of the weather, and we can say that if you work 39 times, it's going to work the 40th time with precision. Okay, so we can see these two leaders being confident at this moment, which we like, and we would like to do. We would like them to have that confidence in their actions. Now, John Krakauer was a reporter from the Outside magazine sent up with Rob Hall's team to cover the expedition. And he writes this in the book. Obviously, the book was written later. So after the fact, based on memories and notes and anecdotes and other stories from other climbers. Rob's feeling was that it wouldn't be him. He was just worried about having to save another team's behind, right? So that means that it's not me. I know what I'm doing. I am confident what I'm doing. It's not me. I'm like overestimating myself. It's always going to be the other people. And this is something that we do every day. We tend to overestimate ourselves. And if something happens, it's not us, it's other people's fault, right? And we kind of need this. It's not that we don't need it. We need to be overconfident, right? But there's, again, the fine line. Okay, so this is the overconfidence part of the movie where they started up and they go up on the summit. Now, I can describe the entire action of the movie or the book here, but let's say they get up and one big decision they had. Now, spoiler alert if you didn't see the movie, they all agreed when they were down at the base camp that wherever they are at 2 o'clock, 2 p.m. on the mountain, wherever they are, at 2 o'clock, they have to turn around and go back to the camp. Okay? And what's very interesting from our point of view is that they all agreed, right? We are in the confines of a house, we're having coffee, relaxed, and yes, we logically agreed that at 2 o'clock, wherever they are on the mountain, they should turn around and go back. Okay? So that's half of the problem. Okay, but then they go up and things turn a little bit ugly because they're unexpected things. They have to fix the ropes. They have to wait for other people so they get a little bit of traffic. And one important scene in the movie is when the postman, Doug, and Rob were about 50 feet or 100 feet from the summit, which is about an hour more to go in those conditions. It's not 50 feet like on a sea level. So it's 2 o'clock and they're having a conversation where Rob taps Doug on the shoulder and says, Doug, it's 2 o'clock. We got to turn around and go back. Well, at this moment, this is a very important scene because Doug turns around. He was also in the expedition last year with Rob, and they didn't get to the summit. They turned around within 50 feet of the summit, just like a very similar situation. And so they couldn't summit. And now, this year, he is in the same situation. And what he says is like, no, I will not turn around. I've given everything I've got to this mountain. I'm going to go and climb. So now, as you can see, the same person who agreed on the big rule of 2 o'clock, turn around and go back wherever you are on the mountain, the logical state with system 2 fully activated, up there within 100 feet of the summit, with system 2 shut down, with system 1 barely hanging on a thread, keeping the human alive. The only system to make a decision was a very weak system 1, and then is full of emotions. So sunk cost effect is very prevalent here, because sunk cost effect says like this: I invested so much effort, time, money in this endeavor. I can't stop now. I have to see it to some kind of completion, no matter what it takes. Fine. So Doug turns around and continues to the summit, and this kind of creates a avalanche of events that goes and leads to some other fatalities. So Doug goes up towards the summit, and what is Rob to do now, right? Well, like, he can't leave his client behind. if the client dies or something happens to him, he'll be somewhat morally at fault because he didn't take care of his client, so he doesn't have much choice but to follow Doug, and they both summit, but now it's too late. It's 4 o'clock by the time they summit, and there's a storm coming, so they have to rush down. Rushing is a bit of a big word, because at that moment you can't rush anywhere. You got to slowly go down to the camp. Anyway, so sunk cost trap is huge in behavioral economics. It's huge for you. In your behavior, it's huge for everybody. It's a tendency for people to escalate commitment to a course of action in which they have made substantial prior investment of time, money, and other resources. And in other words, like I mentioned, I already invested so much time, money, and sweat and everything in this project, I can't stop now. So think about your own projects, at work or personal life, where you put so much money into endeavor, like teaching your kid to play tennis or something. And after a couple of years, few years, is no longer feasible, but you keep going because for whatever reason, the reason doesn't really matter. You keep going because you invested so much, because you keep going because you want this to continue, and there's other, but the point is that you invested so much and you want to keep going. And this is Doug Hansen explaining the sunk cost fallacy in his own words, leading toward his death. And another quote. So sunk cost, before I go to recency, sunk cost is a very powerful trap. And the way I say it's a trap, because you see it, you see the trap in front of you, you understand it. You understand there is a trap, and you understand I put so much money and effort, and you cannot avoid it, or it's very hard to avoid it. The drive that you have to continue on and do not look like a loser, because this is the thing. If you stop a certain time, everything that you've put in so far would be, you have to take a loss. And what do we say about losses in the previous lecture? We don't like them. Therefore, I don't want to consider a loss, and when I'm faced with a loss, what do? I gamble. I'm trying to turn that into a success, right? And I have to continue. So this is the explanation why this sunk cost is so strong, and it cannot be avoided. Many times you cannot. You don't want to look stupid in front of your colleagues or boss, right? So you don't want to take the loss of reputation. So you keep going and try to save it. You're gambling it. And it works most of the time in our regular life, because we're not on top of the mountain Everest trying to make these kind of decisions. But so we get away with it, right? But the sunk cost effect is still there, still very valid, and it should be acknowledged. Hard to do it. It's very hard to do it, to acknowledge the sunk cost effect. Okay, so we talked about overconfident, we talked about sunk cost effect, and now we're going to talk about recency. What is recency? Well, that means we are relying too much, we're putting too much weight in our decision making on recent events. So in this case, like I said, Rob Hall had seen good weather throughout the 90s, and there was no indication that that pattern should not continue into 1996. In sports, we call this the hot streak, or the hot hand. If a player makes 4 shots in the row, then we expect the 5th shot to follow the same pattern and go into the basket. So several seasons of good weather have led people to think of Everest as benevolent, but in the mid-80s, before many of the guides have been on Everest, there were 3 consecutive seasons when no one climbed the mountain because of the ferocious wind. So there you have it, right? The pattern has been broken in the 80s, but then a new pattern starting in the 90s with great weather for climbing, that is. Season after season, Rob had a brilliant weather on sunny day. He'd never been caught in a storm high on the mountain. Very good. So that was our overconfidence, recency, and sunk cost discussion. Now we can talk about heuristic, system 1 and system 2. So what is heuristic? Is a fancy way of saying mental shortcut or rule of thumb. Heuristic, you'll find it in literature, and it's a way of simplifying a complex process, a decision shortcut. And that's all fine. Example, we stereotype. This is another, if we see someone that look like that category or that group, we immediately make references or inferences about that group or the person, profiling. Or, for example, you go to a restaurant and you have a rule of thumb in your head, buying the second least expensive item. You don't want to buy the cheapest, the most expensive item, but you are buying the second least expensive item, or go the other way, second least inexpensive item. If you want to go to the restaurant and order wine to look like you know what you're doing, you don't buy the most inexpensive wine, but you buy the second least inexpensive wine on the list. And guess which one is the most marked up? If the restaurant knows what they're doing, is the second least inexpensive item, wine. So these are some example of heuristics, and they're all ways to simplifying your process, right? We're not searching for the optimal decision, but as we satisfice, we go for the good enough one, and we stop there. And this brings us back to what we discussed before, is that heuristics allow us to arrive to an acceptable outcome, and they substituted hard to solve problem with an easy to solve problem. Remember, when we faced with a hard to solve problem, like which one to buy when we go out for dinner, which type of wine. If you don't know a lot about wines, then you're stumped, right? So then you have to replace this question with an easier one, and then you come up with buy the second least inexpensive wine on the list. Very good. So let's continue with more biases now, and the most three powerful ones are availability, representative, and the confirmation bias. And by the way, each of them have other biases underneath that they're created. So all right, so this is a little bit of a write-up about why we're using a rule of thumbs, and we've been using rule of thumbs all throughout our history. Our brain hasn't really changed much in the past 10,000 years. If you were placed in a different era, anywhere in the history, you would have the same brain capacity. Just the technology and the culture and everything around us has changed, but the brain itself, no. So we're still using the same brain capacity and functions as we used 10,000 years ago, and that's not a bad thing, right? The brain is supposed to keep us alive. That's the main job of it, and it did a good job so far. But okay, but I don't want to say bad things about heuristics. Heuristics are good. We make decisions quicker. We make good enough decisions, that they don't cost us our lives, or, and so they're most of the time they're good. It's only when we overuse them, when we use them in the wrong place, they become biases and they lead us a little bit astray. So I want to say that heuristics are usually a good thing. They allow us to go through our days and make efficient decisions, meaning that we spend the least amount of time and energy to make a decent decision. But it's just that we need to be aware that sometimes we can fall into biases and go a different direction. All right, so in the syllabus, I said that the pattern, the framework of working in this course is unfreeze your decision making. So figure out what's going on in your mind when you make a decision. Change, if possible, by understanding what's going on. You can change some of the decision making pattern and then freeze it back up. So with more knowledge. So this part, we're still into the unfreezing part of your decision-making patterns. Okay, so common biases. I'm going to skip this. This is for reference, Webster definition of bias. So we are on the same page. Okay, this is important. People make mistakes. You should, when you design anything, a website, a process, an environment, a physical room, whatever you design, you have to expect that people are humans and humans make mistakes. What this course is going to help you is to understand that people actually make systematic and predictable mistakes. What does it mean? Systematic? We all do them. Our biases are very similar in each and every one of us. So we all make similar mistakes in similar situations. So you saw it before with different tests and experiments that we've done. So because we all do them and we understand the process, we making them more predictable. So 3 things. We make mistakes. We make systematic mistakes, and because they're systematic, we can predict our own mistakes and maybe others' mistakes. Okay. So we can learn to avoid them and correct them. Very good. So one of the bias that comes from availability bias is called the anchoring bias. Very strong, very powerful. How does the anchoring works? Well, let's start with an experiment, and this is going to be very interesting. So take the last 3 digits of your student ID or social security number or whatever other phone number and write it down, the last 3 digits. Add 400 to it and insert the result in the first blank below where it is the date. So I'm going to read it. The Huns under Attila invaded Europe and penetrated deep into what is now France, where they were defeated and forced to return eastward. Did this event occur before or after AD? And put the date, the number that you just created before. So before or after, right? And then after that, try to answer in what year did Attila's defeat occur. All right, so obviously this is a problem that you don't know unless you're a historian and you're really highly skilled into European history. There's no way you would know this, and that's the whole point. So if you don't know, system 2 is kind of useless here because there's nothing to go on by. You can start making some kind of logical arguments, but there's not much information to go by. So it's more like a system 1 realm here. So what system 1 does, as we discussed, system 1 is interested in creating a coherent story. So he takes what he has, the number that you put, and is trying to stay with that number, anchor into that number, and then adjust. Now you understand that that is a random number. I'm not saying that you don't. You get it. It's a random number. However, it influences your decision because you don't know how much adjustment to make. So when this experiment was given to a bunch of students, this is what the responses are. So if the date that random number was between the column on the left, then every response was on the column on the right. So as you can see, The lower the number, the lower the response. The higher the number, the higher the response. And again, we all understand that this is a random number. We're not fooling anyone. It's a random number. However, not knowing much more than that, we use that number as an anchor, random as it is, and use it to give us the answer. And again, system one is happy because the story is coherent and it sounds good and it sounds right and it looks okay. The correct answer is 451 AD. So it's interesting how anchoring works, and by the way, you can anchor anyone by giving this some kind of number. So in the beginning, there was another experiment that Kahneman and Tversky did when they asked the question, how many countries, what's the percentage of African countries in the UN? But before people answer, they had them spin a roulette with numbers from 1 to 100, right? And you guess by now, their answer was influenced by that random spin of wheel, the roulette wheel. Okay, so the anchoring bias is strong, very strong. You can try to see it yourself every day, try to see it on others. It's usually used for numerical estimates when you ask me like, how tall am I, right? And you don't know me, we haven't met yet, but how tall am I? You can figure out. You start with a number, which is the average male height in the U.S., and then adjust based on whatever you have at your disposal. And that adjustment doesn't work well most of the time. So we use inappropriate anchors and we under adjust. Like if I ask you what is the boiling temperature, for water in the top of Everest, you know it's 100 Celsius on the sea level, so you adjust. Maybe it's less, maybe it's more. You know something about physics. The less the pressure, the lighter the pressure, the quicker it boils, and so on. But you don't know exactly, so you adjust to a certain degree, but not enough. And then same thing with what percentage, like we just discussed. Okay, so, but I can apply anchoring in influencing your decision, your response. All right. So this is actually very prevalent when we talked about surveys. And it turns out that there's a mere measurement effect that we discussed in the beginning, where simply asking a question influences the answer. So there's no way around that. But there's also another way, is that the order of the questions also influences the answer. So not only simply asking the question, but also the order of the question. So if I ask you these two questions in this order, how happy are you with your life in general? Well, pretty happy. How many dates did you have last month? Well, whatever, 0, 2, 1, right? It turns out that there's not much correlation between these two questions in this order. Well, what if I change it? Okay, if I change it and I'm going to ask how many dates did you have last month? Well, not that many. And how happy are you with your life in general? Well, not that satisfied. So you can see that if people were asked happiness question first, it was a weak correlation, about 0.12 between the answers. But if they were asked dating first, it was a strong correlation, 66.66. Okay, so when we construct questions for survey, this is a very important, and this is a big piece of behavior when they do marketing and advertising and customer surveys and so on. So you have to be aware that the order of the questions might influence the answers, and be prepared to counteract that. Very well. So moving on to anchoring bias on ourselves. So the class survey goes like this: what percentage of students own an iPad, iPhone, whatever, doesn't matter. you can replace it with an iPhone. Students with iPods, they thought that 68% of the students in the class will own an iPod. Students without iPods thought that 42% of the students in the class own iPad. So if I own an iPhone or iPad or iPod, I assume that most people are like me, and I am anchoring on myself, and then I assume that most of us are like me, and 68% is the number that I come up with. If I don't have an iPhone or iPad, then I assume that most people don't have an iPhone and an iPad, and that goes down a little bit, the number. So you got to think of anchoring. We are anchoring ourselves because this is the easiest way to reference something, is the most up-to-date information we have about ourselves, and that's why you get these discrepancies in the numbers. The false consensus effect is that we think that others are similar to ourselves, and maybe not. It's something that you don't know. It could be true in certain situations, not true in others. So it's something that you have to be aware that when you're anchoring on yourself. The anchoring bias is very strong. It's a strong bias in behavior economics, and it really helps a lot with influencing decisions on your users, your customers, or your peers, your friends. If you move from LA to Boston, obviously you're influenced by the prices that you paid last. Limit 2 per customer, it's something that it's anchoring. So, or limit 10, you see people trying to push to the anchor. So 10 is an anchor, 2 is an anchor. So we're influenced. We don't need 10 items of that, 10 of that item, but because that we adjust, we try to adjust, and we under adjust, and we buy maybe 8, and we still don't need 8. So that's the idea, that you're trying to reach the anchor, and even if you adjust, you don't adjust enough. And this is very strong when we talk about retirement, and pension, and how people participate in retirement accounts. You'll see how this anchoring works very strongly. Moving on to availability bias. Like I said, availability bias generates few other biases, and one is ease of recall. So I'll tell you a problem here. Please order the following causes of death in 2008 by placing a 1 to the most common cause, a 2 to the second most common cause, and so on. So if you think that war and civil conflict is the most common cause, put a 1, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, up to 5. Okay, so think about that. If you go to these fact sheets on World Health Organization, you will find that the answer is actually mostly different than you thought. The respiratory infections are the highest, starvation, war, it's the lowest. And the question is, why were your answers wrong? Well, one thing is that vividness and ease of recall, right? The media is full of questions about wars and terrorists and planes crashing and shark attacks. But it's actually very low chance that you are actually dying in a shark attack or in a terrorist attack than to die from respiratory infection, right? So because of the media covers and the information that we have available in our minds are related to war and terrorists and shark attacks, and in that case, this is the only thing that you can recall, and you're thinking that is much more frequent than it actually is. Okay. So when you go to the airport, even these days, in some airports, you'll have to take your shoes off, and for that you have to thank a bad guy in 2001 from Paris to Miami. the guy was trying to take his shoe and lighten up to bomb the plane in 2001, and since then, because of that ease of recall, what would happen if someone has a shoe that will explode, then we keep taking our shoes off for the next 18, 19 years, right? So this ease of recall, the vividness of a recall, is very strong bias, and we are very disposed to follow it. Remember when we talk about how reliable are Hondas in lecture 1, then the only thing you have to figure it out is how many Hondas I have seen on the side of the road that are broken down, so you use this bias to come up with an answer. In the workplace is very prevalent. The availability heuristic is very, very strong in most of us, in all of us actually. In a workplace, managers will recall your last performance, so what you did in the last 2 months rather than in the beginning of the year. And in classroom, when students if they don't know the material, they are thinking that they're going to be called upon because they remember that they don't know the material, so the chances are higher that they get called upon. The professor doesn't know, but this is the perception we have. The question is also here, is like, when do you buy insurance? And you buy insurance after the event has taken place, after you had a crash, after your house had flooded or so on. So because it's so easy to, or maybe a friend of yours house has flooded or had a crash, and that's why you buy insurance, when that event is still vivid, still easy to recall in your memory. All right, bias number 2 is called retrievability, is based on memory structures, and it goes like this. In 4 pages of a novel, about 2,000 words, how many words would you expect to find that have the form blank, 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 ing? So 7-letter word that ends with ing. Indicate your best estimate by circling one of the following values. So circle one of the groups and move on to the next page, which is similar. In 4 pages of a novel, about 2,000 words, how many words would you expect to have that have the form blank, 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 and blank? So 7-letter words similar that have n in the 6th position. Indicate your best estimate by circling one of the following values. So you get to circle again. Okay, you've done it. So let's look at your answers and see what you notice. Did you notice that you have more? Did you circle more here than here? Is that true? If that is true, then you have fallen for the retrievability bias, because there's no way you're going to have more ing letters than n letters. Makes sense? Because ing is included in n. But so what happens? It was very easy for you to recall words with ing, many of them. Not so easy to recall words with just n in the 6th position, although ing are included. Ing words are included in this category. Okay, so that's why it was much easier for you to recall. Now, with the same idea, try to answer these questions, and I'm going to let you post in the forum the answers to this. Okay, so think about the availability bias. Okay. All right, so as you can see, it's very prevalent. We like people that are like us, that belong to our social network. We're social animals, and job search goes in the same way. Very good. In conclusion, we need to understand when intuition will lead us astray so that we can avoid selecting the most available option, which is back to satisficing. The representativeness bias. Let's go and let's talk about this example. You can read it. A certain town is served by 2 hospitals. In the larger hospital, about 45 babies are born each day. In the smaller hospital, 15 babies are born each day. As you know, about 50% of all babies are boys. However, the exact percentage of boys varies from day to day. Sometimes it might be higher than 50%, sometimes lower. For a period of 1 year, each hospital recorded the days in which more than 60% of the babies were boys. Which hospital do you think recorded more such days? The larger hospital, the smaller hospital, or about the same? So write down your answer to this. And there's a follow-up question to kind of guide you. Which is more likely, getting more than 60% heads in 3 flips of a coin, or getting more heads in 3,000 flips of a coin? So 50% of the time we get 3 flips producing 60%, 17%, and that. Okay. So think about your hospital. Okay. The larger or the smaller? Okay. We will talk about this in the forum. I'm sure you got the right answer, which is smaller hospital. Implication of this bias. So you see this advertising every time, all the time. 4 out of 5 dentists recommend sugarless gum for their patients. And what does it mean for you? You know, what is it? How does it influence your decision? Would you agree with it? Would you not agree with it? Right? The question is that the answer is it means nothing. It's absolutely nothing. I can easily find 5 dentists out of which 4 of them will recommend this gum if the sample size is just 5, right? I don't know the sample size, so I really can't tell you if this is true or false or anything, really. Obviously, the higher the sample size, the better. The smaller the sample size, the worse it is. So really this means nothing, but you find this all the time. Another bias coming from representative bias is a misconception of chance. You and your spouse have had 3 children together, all of them girls. Now that you're expecting the 4th child, you wonder what are the odds to have a boy this time. What is the best estimate of your probability of having another girl, right? So you have to pick something like this, you know, and the answer is B. The gender determination is an independent event, it's a chance event, so really doesn't make any difference if you had a boy or a girl before. All right. How likely is to flip a coin 8 times in a row and get one of the following sequences? All right. And I really want you to do it. So take a coin, flip it 20 times, and write down the sequences of the heads and tails. Right? Which one doesn't look more random? Which one is more random? All right. So back to the issue of hot hand. There was a study done in '85. They studied Philadelphia 76ers and the Boston Celtics, and they found no evidence of the hot hand. There was no evidence that if you shoot 4 baskets in a row, the 5th one will go in, or anything like that. Right? So there's no such thing as hot hand, but you can hear the sports commentators saying this all the time. He's hot today. He's on fire because he shot 4. Last 4. So I remember, I can recall that the last 4 shots were in, so I expect that the 5th one goes into the basket as well. And this is part of our, system 1. We are searching for patterns. We want to find patterns no matter where. On Mars, remember they were looking for a face on Mars a long time ago. We are searching for patterns everywhere we go because it helps us make decisions, right? And if we get a pattern, we can start inferring, can create a story behind it, and and get an answer quicker and most efficient. So patterns work, and especially when we look for faces, right? We are certain, especially with faces, we know exactly the pattern, and we're looking for this pattern everywhere we go. However, obviously, we are looking for patterns sometimes where there are no patterns, and we still want to find patterns. The conjunction fallacy. The best student in the introductory MBA class writes poetry and is rather shy and small in stature. What was the student undergraduate major? Chinese studies and psychology, right? So, what do you answer? Think about it for a second. We'll come back to it. But think about it. What is more likely? Chinese studies or psychology? The confirmation trap. The sequence of 3 numbers below follows a rule, and your task is to diagnose that rule. I will tell you if your sequence of 3 numbers follows the rule. And here are the numbers: 2, 4, 6. What is the next number? And yes, I know that most of you will say 8, and it's a done deal. It's like there's no question that is 8, because everything goes up by 2, and that is your rule that you came up with. But I'm telling you that is not necessarily true. It's one of the rules, not necessarily true. I say that my rule is any ascending number. Okay? So how did you come up with your rule, and what evidence did you gather to support that rule? So what you did is you come up with a good enough solution, right? You satisficed, and you put 2, 4, 6, 8 is the next number, and that was good enough, but there was no evidence that this is the rule. So you should really question yourself and try to avoid the confirmation bias. Try to seek evidence to the contrary, which is something that we don't do very well. Science does well for us. Science always look for null hypothesis, where they're trying to negate the assumption that we made. But us, no. We always looking for evidence to support our statements, right? So we only extract the evidence that support our statements. And if you ever watch a game where you and your friend are fans of the opposite teams, and if something happened, you will argue endlessly about what just happened, and you'll find only evidence that will support your conclusion and not theirs, right? And this is very, very common. The confirmation trap or bias is very common in our decision making. Okay? It helps to find the devil's advocate. It helps to find a trusted friend that can control you and that you have patience enough to let him tell you where you go wrong. But at some point in time, I assume that you're going to get tired of it. However, when you make a certain decision, when you make decisions that are important, try to find the opposite view and see if you can argue it or debate it. It's hard, it's time consuming, we don't want to do it, but that's the way of going about getting better decisions. The next effect, a very important one, the halo effect. The halo effect is that we take whatever available information we have and we form impression, we form opinions of it. This is not necessarily wrong, but because it's based on the information that we get. If that information is correct, then obviously we're not going to be wrong. But if the information is not enough, not incorrect, because we can catch that. But if it's not enough, not in a certain quantity or even quality, then it could be we could reach the wrong impression. So the halo effect is we take something that is an attribute of an object, and we take that attribute and we blow it up, and we think that the object is based on that attribute alone. So, for example, the effect heuristics, it says that we tend to think that attractive people are also because they're more attractive, this halo effect extends to they are being more intelligent, more kind, more friendly, and more trustworthy, right? So we're taking one aspect, attractiveness, and we extend that aspect to other characteristics of the person, intelligence, kindness, friendliness, and so on. And this is very true, and not only with people, but with products. If you go into product management, then you have this effect heuristic where you say that the halo effect is also present, where if attractive products are perceived to work better. All right, so we're trying to blow up something from a small attribute to a larger impression of the product or the person. In one study, people were asked to evaluate the price of a 2-pack of ballpoint pens priced at $2.89. Okay, so you have a 2 ballpoint pens at $2.89. When they were, so the manipulation is we change in the store they were bought it from. So we ask, is $2.89 a low price because we bought these pens from Walmart, right? And because Walmart has low prices in general, right? We take that halo effect and apply it to this particular pack of ballpoint pens, and you say, yes, it should be a low price. If I tell you that I bought this pack of ballpoint pens from a magazine shop, from the airport, you know that magazine shop usually higher prices than Walmart, and you regard the $2.89 as being a high price. Okay, there's no way of knowing if it was in absolute value, but you took the information available to you and you applied it to the object in question. So price perception changed the purchase decision, right? So in a very similar study, 1/2 of participants were told that they were seeing a selection of options from a low-price grocery store, food for less, and the other half were told that the selection is from Whole Foods, right? And the results, when told that the products are from food for less, they thought they bought a higher price product, and when they're from Whole Foods, they bought a lower price product. So within a range, we buy the highest price product from a low price store, and vice versa for high price store, we buy the lower price product. Okay, so think about it for a second, how this range effect is used with halo effect, and we'll continue on from here. So in case of the Whole Foods, knowing that Whole Foods is a quality environment, it's a quality store, buying the lowest price product doesn't hurt your, values about food. And when you know that the store is a low price store, like food for less, you're buying the highest price product because you're thinking that it's better quality in that particular store. Okay, so this is very interesting how this affects our opinion, and this says a lot about how we price products and services. Okay, so that was the biases part. Let's talk about how we solve problems and what to do with creativity thinking and how. So I'll give you a break here, and I want you to solve this problem. On one side of the river, there's 3 missionaries marked with M and 3 cannibals marked with C. You got to move them on the other side without getting in trouble with each other. So you got to plan the passage. So think about it for a second, take a break, and solve this problem. And here's the solution. I'll let you just solve it. It's quite interesting. And we're getting to the point where what to do when you're stumped and you don't know how to go around, and you try to make decisions and you're not finding. Now, obviously, you know a lot more now about making decisions than before this course starts. You realize there are so many biases that we need to be aware of. You understand now how main biases affect our decision making and how they affect our daily decision and daily pockets, if you want, with the pricing and everything. So when you're stumped, you have to relax and don't be afraid to try something different. And we went through this before. Learn how to use your unconscious problem solving ability, brainstorming. Don't rule out the problems too quickly. Be non-judgmental, work backwards, and try to come up with more choices, more alternatives, and find out if they are holding up after you apply these biases. So now I repeat this slide from last lecture because now you have more biases that you can add to your toolbox, and you're trying to avoid or mitigate the effect of these biases. Remember, some of the biases you cannot totally avoid, but at least you know they're there, which is a very important step in your decision making. Let's talk about how we improve decision making. What are the steps that we can take to improve our decision making? There are a few strategies that we need to discuss. One is acquiring experience and expertise, right? After you've done a few things many times, you're getting better at them, at doing them, and you can avoid traps and so on. Judgment, try to debias judgment so you know where the biases are. When you make a decision, check for biases that if you made, and try to plug in where you have biases by trying other strategies of debiasing them. Take an outside view. That means get a devil's advocate, get a friend, step outside of the decision for a second and see if it's the right if it's the right way. Get some help from others, right? And then practice understanding biases in others. So let's take one by one. Acquiring experience and expertise. Learning in general, it occurs in two steps. In experience, you try to do something and you get feedback. Yes, no, maybe it worked, it didn't work, and so on. Without this loop, the learning process would not function properly. So if you keep doing things and you don't get feedback if you did them right or wrong, then there's no way of improving, right? So you're trying to build your catalog of experiences, which in turn increases your intuition. We haven't talked about intuition yet, but intuition is a mental catalog, and if you're faced with a new situation, you're checking against that mental catalog of yours, which is the intuition. And if you've seen this before, you can relate. If you didn't see, you have that uneasy feeling, or you have to try something new. And experience and expertise, you got to figure out which one plays which role. Experience alone is not enough, and expertise alone is not enough either. Debiasing judgment, you're trying to reduce or eliminate biases from your cognitive strategies of the decision maker. Okay. First of all, you have to understand where biases can occur, right? Even if you can fix them, you have to understand that they might happen, which direction it's going to go, which direction is going to influence your decision, get some feedback on the bias, and get some help to improve the judgment. And I have to warn you, it's not an easy process. Debiasing, it's hard. It's competing against our own bias, so that is a very hard thing to do. How to do it is you unfreeze, like we discussed. You are being aware of your biases in your judgment. You try to change, and then you try to put them back with a better decision. That might or may not work in the beginning. It's a learning curve that you have to go through, but it's very important, very powerful. If you're taking an outsider's view, you ask for a devil's advocate view, or take advice from the experts, especially on things that you don't do very often and you don't have practice, like buying a house, getting a mortgage, right? Having your first child, and so on. So you have to get experience or expertise first as much as you can, and then go through the process itself. So these are the strategies that we went through, and again, it's a system 2 process, not a system 1. So system 2 has the potential of training system 1. So these strategies are obviously the system 2 realm, where you have to think about the decisions and think logically, where the biases might occur, how to mitigate them, and how to eventually avoid them altogether. In conclusion, we went through this lecture, we went through some very important biases. By no means we have exhausted the list. There are many others, but these are the most powerful ones that you find fighting every day. And I suggest that you go back and see them again and see how they apply to you. And now, if you are having this new tool in your toolbox, how to identify biases, see during the day, take one day and see how these biases affect your own decision. Okay, and I thank you very much for your time. This was a lecture number 3, very strong concepts about biases, and I'll see you in lecture 4. Thank you so much.